Good morning and welcome to the second meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2020. Apologies have been received from committee member Andy Whiteman, and the first item on the agenda is to take item 4 in private. Is the committee agreed? As the committee has agreed, we will now move on to item 2 on the agenda, which is on the climate change plan. And we have with us this morning 3 witnesses. They are, first of all, Morag Watson, Director of Policy at Scottish Renewables, Sam Peacock, who is the Director of Corporate Affairs and Strategy at SSE, and Charles Wood, who's the Head of New Energy Services and Heat of Energy UK. So welcome to all 3 of you. If I might ask, when a question's put to you, just to give a few seconds for broadcasting to turn your mic on rather than doing what's natural, which is just to come straight in. And we have about a limited time this morning for questions and answers, and quite a few questions from committee members. So if I could ask witnesses to keep their answers short, sharp and to the point. And also don't feel you need to answer every single question put by every single committee member, but we'll see how the discussion develops. So we'll start off, first of all, with questions from committee member Graham Simpson. Graham Simpson.
Yeah, thanks, convener, and good morning to the panel. I'm just going to start off by asking about targets. We've had recent figures that show that 19% of energy consumption, and that's electricity, heat and transport, came from renewables in 2017. Now that rose to 21% in 2018. If we kept on that trajectory, it would lead to achieving 45% by 2030. So what needs to happen, panel, to achieve the 2030 target of 50% of all energy consumption coming from renewables? So that's the first question. And does the draft climate change plan that we've seen set out the right actions? And what should be included in the revised energy strategy? Thank you. Who wants that?
I can start with that one, convener, if that's helpful.
Yes, so, certainly.
Certainly, thank you. So I'll maybe take your questions in the reverse order there. In terms of the Climate Change Action Plan update, we do consider it to be a very credible suite of actions that need to be taken to meet our climate change targets, and we very much welcome the content of it. What we would caveat that with, though, is there is a degree of detail missing from it. We don't yet have a detailed action plan of how things would roll out. In terms of your second question, today, we've very much focused on electricity, and at the moment, 90% of Scotland's electricity comes from renewable sources. We very much expect that to be 100% once the figures come out. Our next really big horizon is going to be heat. Now, to date, we haven't hit our targets on that. We should have had 11%, but we're only at 6.5%. But the things that are in the Climate Action Plan, the District Heat Networks Bill that's going through Parliament, and the Developing Heat Pump Sector Deal will certainly be a step change in that sector and that area. To date, low carbon heat has been a somewhat neglected area of policy, but it's very much come to the fore. And over the next 10 years, if we put all of those actions into practice, very much we would expect to see us hitting our targets there.
I think Sam Peacock wanted to come on, and he's put an R in the chat box, which is, if I may say, the best and easiest way for us to keep track of who's coming in and out of the discussion. So Sam Peacock.
Morning, everybody, and thanks for having us here this morning. I think it's good that we've got the target. It's the first point. It's good to have something the industry can point towards. You can line up projects, you can line up supply chain, you can get movement in the right direction. I suppose from the developer perspective on renewables, maybe there's 3 or 4 obstacles that probably stand in our way at the moment. I won't talk through micro detail on any of them, but planning, at the moment it takes a bit too long to get a wind farm from beginning into actually being out there delivering. 11 years for an offshore wind farm on average, too long. We'll talk about maybe planning framework a bit later. Grid connections, we need the grid to be there. At the moment, there's a lot of work going on with the UK government around how you coordinate offshore grids. So it's not just these sort of point-to-point connections as we've had in the past. That needs to work, and that needs to be done on time. And I'll probably just say the third one I'd bring out, which is one that sounds techy and a bit boring, but actually is really, really important, is grid charging. So at the moment, there's a very, very complicated Ofgem methodology around how you charge wind farms for use of the grid. And at the moment, it's heavily skewed towards southern projects and away from Scottish projects, where the cost in energy terms about £3 a megawatt hour per premium on the Scottish project, when you're compared to UK ones, and you'd expect an overall project to come in at maybe £40 a megawatt hour. So it's quite a reasonable premium that's currently slowing things down. If we don't get a bit of movement to that, you might continue with this world where Scottish projects aren't winning the auctions. It was only our SSE Sea Green project that won last time. So those are probably some of the things to start looking at, that I'd say, Graham.
Okay, that's useful. Does anyone else want to come in on that?
Charles Wood, I think, wanted to come in.
Right, Charles.
Thank you, convener, and thank you to all those attending. It's a good question, but it is a challenging question in terms of how do you go beyond changing power to low carbon and make sure that the use in transport, in heat, in everything else is also low carbon. And one thing that hasn't quite been touched on as much as I'd like it to from the previous questions, but great answers from the other two, is the customer end of things. Yes, heat decarbonisation is absolutely critical. We need to accelerate that. We need to continue with the accelerated decarbonisation of transport in the form of electric vehicles. And that means that there are new end user assets that we need to be using more smartly. We need to be figuring out how to use those assets so that they're using the most of the existing assets that you have and the future generation capacity that is yet to be built. So smart use of those technologies and the inclusion of things like storage at various different levels of the energy network will help us to increase the amount of renewable energy that we can actively use at any given time. And our members are already providing a lot of different services that allow you to do that, time of use tariffs that effectively match up your use with when low carbon generation is being utilised. So just wanted to flag that the customer end is also really important there.
Okay, I think they were very useful answers. Charles touched on transport.
I think
Sorry,
there's a slight glitch in the my IT there, I think. Did you have a question on transport, Graham?
Yes, I was about to ask that. Is that okay?
Okay, well, if you want to briefly do that, please.
Yeah, Charles mentioned transport, and of course we've not made a great deal of progress there. Emissions from transport have not really fallen, so I think that's the next big challenge. And I just wonder if the witnesses have anything to say on what needs to happen there. I mean, if you think of us as individuals, and most of us are still driving around in petrol or diesel cars. If we're lucky enough to have a car, we travel on buses and trains that are largely not electric. So what actually needs to happen? It seems to me we need to be quite ambitious. Perhaps we'll start with you, Charles, seeing as you mentioned it.
That is a very useful question. Transport is absolutely intricately linked to energy at this point. It's no longer a separate field. It's something that's merging into the electricity sector and the low carbon gas sector as well. I think I would caution against the sort of hesitancy you have there on how much ambition we've had and how much progress we've seen, because we absolutely have seen progress, and the introduction of 2030 targets has been one area in which progress is very clear. There is charging infrastructure across Scotland in particular and across various other parts of the UK that is reducing people's anxiety about how far they can get with their electric vehicle and if an electric vehicle would meet their needs. And we also have an increasing number of really just expanded capabilities for these electric vehicles. And if people drive them, they immediately sort of have a better experience. They will, by word of mouth, share that experience. And that will increasingly happen as people see this looming 2030 target. So increasingly, you're going to see public use of transport changing over, and that is included in this plan. You're going to see a lot of businesses using their next sort of cycle of purchasing of vehicles to buy these electric vehicles. And then in 5 years' time, they will put those into the second-hand market where an increase in people purchasing them will be seen. So we have to wait for things to sort of tick along. But I think the ambition and the speed of movement and the rate of change is actually more impressive than you would think. And it will continue on that sort of trajectory of just increasing and increasing in speed and in capability over the years.
Sam Peacock.
Just a very quick point. The thing to watch here, I think, for the committee is to watch the next price control process for the distribution network. So the kind of the regional networks that take electricity to people's homes and businesses, because we will need the electricity network to be in great shape to enable more EV charging and more electrification of heat in the way that we've already been talking about. And I think what we've been asking for is that the regulatory regime around that allows a lot of consultation with local authorities and people who actually know what's going on the ground, then enable investment ahead of need in the network so that we then got this good electricity network sitting there where we can easily plug in charging methodology. So that's the area over the next year as plans start to form that I think will be of real interest to the committee.
All right, thank you for those comments. May I ask, I mean, currently we have 740 megawatts of offshore wind planned or being installed in Scottish waters. So is it realistic to expect this to increase so significantly by 2030 up to 8 to 11 gigawatts? And I mean, is the contribution from the Scottish government in terms of meeting net zero in Scotland, is it sufficient? And what do the panel members have to say about that? Sam Peacock.
I think the ambition's there, but we've just got to get all these things pulling in the right direction. I think one of the things for us around this has been, is the next stage of the work some sort of delivery plan that monitors progress as we go along? If we had a net zero delivery plan that we update each year, we can see whether some of these projects are coming through at the pace of change speed that we need. Now, on your specific question around renewables, I think we can get there if the ScotWind process is effective, if we can find a way of getting this kind of grid charging methodology changed so that Scottish projects aren't penalised and carry a cost premium against UK projects, then there's absolutely nothing stopping us delivering what we need to deliver on offshore wind from our perspective. I think it's a huge opportunity for Scotland, and there's a bunch of companies like us who are prepared to invest in it, and policy framework's pretty good. We just got to get planning, grid and charging aligned so that these are all pointing in the same direction. At the moment, they're not quite.
And I think we'd lost Morag Watson briefly there. So I've been asking about whether it's realistic to expect the increase that we're looking for in terms of offshore wind generation, 740 megawatts to 8 to 11 gigawatts in the years to 2030, just to fill you in. I think Charles Wood, did you want to come in on this particular point? I don't know, or does Morag have any comment on that particular issue about how realistic this goal is?
I'd certainly direct you towards Morag.
Well, start with Morag could come in then. Thanks, Charles.
Apologies, convener, my internet dropped off there for a second, but I'm back with you. So in terms of the targets that we have for offshore wind in Scottish waters, they are very realistic. As an industry, we've looked carefully at them to ensure that they are ones that we were quite confident that we can meet. Colleagues have already touched on the two main issues there, that we have the issue of getting consents and permissions through as quickly as we can. That 11-year time frame to build out offshore would make meeting the targets challenging if we can't reduce that. And my colleagues have already touched on the problems with offshore grid connections and planning permission being the two major bumps in the road that we will need to overcome in terms of putting more generation onto the system. So yes, it is doable, but certain things will need to change in terms of policy, grid charging and consenting to be able to do that.
All right, I think now we'll come on to questions from Maurice Golden, if we may. Maurice Golden.
Thank you, convener. I'm interested in transmission and distribution networks, and specifically recently the Scottish TOs produced business plans, and I was just wondering the panel's thoughts on the impact of those business plans, both on security of supply as well as any potential impact on cost to consumers. Who would like to? Is Sam a good place to start with this question, perhaps?
Yes, absolutely. No, it's a great question. The transmission business plans were designed with sort of net zero and Scottish net zero targets in mind. So transmission being a kind of motorway, the pipes and the electricity wires that almost act like the motorways in the north of Scotland, which we run. We had an ambitious plan in there to make sure that it matched the renewables ambition of Scotland. And that's the sort of for the next price control. And I think we've got to a place of Ofgem where hopefully we should still be on track. But because of the sheer length of time it takes to do some of these developments, we already now need to start looking ahead to the next business plan that will be starting off in 4 or 5 years' time, which will be the real crunch one for getting some of these ScotWind renewables connected. So we think we're on the right glide path with the current business plan for the North of Scotland, but we're already working on the next one, and that next one I think may be even more important for the Scotland renewables objectives. That's probably what I said. The only other thing I've just linked to the last comment is I would also the price controls for the distribution network, which is maybe, let's call it the smaller roads delivering it to people's homes, is really important for all of this. Really, really important for the heat and transport conversation that we've just had. And that debate and making sure that that network and the business plans we're putting in for that, which is this year, are fit for purpose and matching climate change ambitions is absolutely critical. Now we're working very hard on that at the moment, Mr. Golden, and we'll hopefully have something to share with people in about June when we submit it, and happy to get that around committee members so they can see.
And just in terms of the specific point around cost to consumers.
For transmission, I'll need to look at it, and I'll come back to committee if I'm wrong on this, but it's a very, very small part of the bill, and I think the last price control we were adding £7 onto the bill for it, but let me come back to the committee if I've got that wrong, because that's just, I'm clutching at the back of my memory on that. There will be costs involved in net zero, and actually one of the big debates I think is how we make sure these costs are allocated fairly, so that those who can't afford to pay for them are protected. And I think work on the just transition is really, really important in all this, because as we do all the stuff that we want to do to tackle climate change, there is a bill there with it, and we need to make sure that it's paid fairly across society, which I think is at the heart of your point.
Yeah, and just as a brief follow-up to that, Sam, in terms of how transmission costs are allocated to consumers, is it the case that those further away pay more for those costs, or how are they apportioned?
It's a hideously complicated system where people in Ofgem have made quite an industry out of it. There is some protection for Northern Scotland network, which comes from this thing called the hydro benefit, where it's a sort of because that network's obviously more expensive to run, some consumers there and generators there are protected by some costs. There's a kind of cushion to some extent that takes some of the costs off. But actually, we thought there's more of a case for doing even more here. I mean, in reality, the network is, your postcode shouldn't really determine why you have a particular cost associated with this. And we've always been of the mind that actually consumers across the country really should have some sort of flat payment, because if we're building more renewables in Scotland to help power parts of Scotland and the rest of the UK, there's a very, very common sense argument that says that's a social good that those Scottish consumers are contributing towards. So there is room for reform in this hideously complicated area, which I probably haven't done justice, Mr. Golden, but there's room for reform in it, definitely, in making it a bit more fair and a bit more even-handed, particularly for consumers in the north of Scotland.
And just as another very big... Oh.
So I think Morag Watson wanted to come in on this as well.
Okay.
Right. So just picking up on the points that Sam made there, one of the things that is a key concern from industry around the networks is Ofgem was not set up to operate in a net zero world. Its remit is very clear, which is to minimise cost for consumers, which we would all support. But now we need to minimise cost to consumers in a net zero context, which is quite different. So we consider it untenable that we can go forward towards our net zero targets without there being some change in the way regulation happens. In terms of the transmission network, in our old system, it was set up really sensibly. It's a locational charge. It's to very much encourage you to put the generation as close to the users as possible. So we need the minimum amount of grid infrastructure and it costs the least. When we used hydrocarbons and we could move the fuel around to the generating centre, that was perfectly sensible thing to do. But now we need to put the generation where the resource is, and most of it is in the northeast of Scotland, while the bulk of the consumers are in the south. So this is an issue that we're looking at. We've been working with Ofgem very closely ourselves and our colleagues at Renewable UK on how we do this. But as Sam has already alluded to, this is an unbelievably complicated system where, you know, even Keith Bell, who works on this for the Committee on Climate Change, is one of Chris Stark's team. Unpicking this one is going to take time. So what we would look to for the Scottish Government and for the Scottish Parliament is to keep up the pressure that something needs to change, because a solution needs to be found to both protect consumers and get the generation that we need. But we are not convinced as much time is being given to that as should be given.
Thank you for that. Sometimes, as you've highlighted, it's helpful if politicians don't get involved in a highly complicated and technical charging regime, but they often like to. Anyone else? Got any comments?
Does Charles Wood want to come in briefly before we move on to the next questions? Charles Wood.
Yes, just to the final point there, that industry wouldn't want you to get involved in highly complex charging regimes. I think not to the extent where we don't need you to read up on it and understand it perfectly, but we absolutely do want you to continue to push for a just and fair transition and a appropriate proportioning of the costs of the transition. So keep that voice up, keep that momentum going, and we will deal with the detail wherever we can. But please do keep the pressure on.
All right. Thank you. And now to Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Convener. I just wanted to ask, and this continuing the questions about security of supply, the updated climate change plan has been said it's been ambitious and is welcomed, and I think Morag said it was a credible suite of actions, but of course not everything is in the gift of the Scottish Government. And I heard this morning some of the areas of concern are planning, connection charges, and etc. And the UK Government's responsible for ensuring there is favourable market conditions and incentives to support investment in infrastructure. So are there any other issues you haven't touched upon this morning that we have to look at in order to ensure that we get the investment necessary so that all renewables that are being planned are actually able to connect to the network and ensure we have a security of supply.
Sam Peacock and then Morag Watson.
It's a great question, and it's a very, very good question. I think if I was to think about which plates are spinning, which maybe aren't, according to in what we want to achieve in energy, the renewables plate is spinning, subject to the points that we talked about now, and that feels like we're in a good place. We need to sort some stuff out, but we're okay. We're in a decent place. If we can get the price controls right for the electricity networks, again, which shouldn't be beyond the wit of man, that plate seems to be spinning. I think the bit where it gets trickier is when we have flexible plant to keep the lights on when the wind isn't blowing, and we make sure that that is zero carbon. And the two routes, I would say this wouldn't like, because it's areas where SSE is interested in it, but we see a lot of potential for carbon capture and storage. We may come to that later, but we see strong potential for decarbonising. Peterhead State Power Station, which at the moment has been running very hard to help keep the lights on at important times when we really need it, but at some point that needs to be decarbonised, and we've got serious plans of which we could do that. And but that plate is slightly moving, but certainly not spinning. We haven't got the proper support mechanism in place in the UK government, and there's room to go on that. And probably the other plate that isn't really spinning on flexibility is batteries or pumped storage. We think in Scotland, and the report was great on this, that there's huge potential for pumped storage hydro, which really you can only do in Scotland. Across the UK, effectively the technology says that you have a hydro dam, and then at times of low demand and low electricity prices, you can pump water up the dam, so you can then use it when you need it to power electricity. And that plate is not spinning at all. We've got a great project that could bring great Scottish jobs. There are other projects that other developers have got as well, but we don't have the policy foundations in place for something which could really contribute a hell of a lot to Scottish security of supply. So that's probably what I would say on the security of supply element of your question.
And is there any specific reasons coming from the UK government about why these, to put it the way that you said, these plates aren't spinning?
They would probably, sorry.
On nuclear, for instance, sorry.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, that's a very expensive technology that they seem to be obsessed with for some reason. But I think they would argue that the CCUS plate, this carbon capture plate, is beginning to spin. They've set up the beginnings of a policy framework for it, and we're just trying to hold them account to actually delivery of it. But on hydro pump storage, I honestly don't know. We've been talking for a while about the fact that this type of infrastructure can contribute in the way that interconnectors do, and it actually needs a support system framework that's very similar to interconnectors. Doesn't need a whole bunch of subsidy, but just needs a way of making sure that its revenues are stable, which is very basic regulatory practice. I don't know, maybe we haven't been good enough at getting on people's radars, but we've been trying to, and the potential for pump storage is huge, and it is a bit of an odd gap that UK government haven't helped drive it forward, to be perfectly honest.
Does Morag or Charles want to come in on this?
I think Morag was, yes.
Yeah, just coming in there. So I would reiterate the point that Sam has made on pump storage, hydro. It will be a really essential part of the mix to keep that reliability of supply and to have storage on the network. We're also going to see more storage projects coming forward, and it's something that the Scottish planning system has not had to deal with to a very great extent so far. But as the new National Planning Framework 4 comes forward, it needs to have provision built into it to allow more storage to be put on the grid. That will be quite essential. The other thing that really needs to happen is, at the moment, our electricity system is very centralised. We can think of it like a tree, with the transmission being the trunk and the distribution being the branches. It is very clear, and it's clearly acknowledged, that in the future we will not have a system like that. We will have local energy systems, which you can imagine a bit more as like a a honeycomb of different cells all interlinked, where energy generation and use is much more localized, but the whole system is connected together. So if one cell goes down, it can draw from the others. We are only just beginning to see the models of how this would work in practice emerging, and the Scottish Government has been very supportive of the work that's happening up in Orkney, which is one of the groundbreaking projects demonstrating how this might be done, where you integrate together generation, use and storage all in one big system. The other thing that will be really important going forward that we've not touched on yet is hydrogen. Hydrogen is not an energy in of itself, it's just an energy vector. It's a way of storing and moving energy quite effectively. We were very pleased to see the Scottish Government's hydrogen assessment and position statement come out before Christmas, and we are looking forward to seeing their action plan coming out. It is a huge opportunity for Scotland, and with our abundant renewable energy resources, Scotland really could be a green powerhouse around green hydrogen, and that will be very important for balancing our system. So we would want to see the potential that is in those documents that we've seen so far realised, as it will be a huge benefit to our country. Thank you.
And Charles Wood, you wanted to comment on this?
Yes, I'll keep my answer short, as I think I'll be reiterating some of the points that Morag and Sam have already made. But just to say that UK government might not be spinning the plates yet, but they are sorting those plates out at least. So we expect publications coming in the next few months that will give more direction, but that's no reason for Scotland to wait on the UK. There are many areas in which Morag and Sam have already pointed out where you could go faster.
And just on that point, Charles, while you're on, how, given the backdrop that Scotland exports 28% of its electricity according to 2019 to south of the border, and the UK is also dependent on the EU exporting 15%, up to 15% to the UK, how urgent is that these issues are dealt with so that we can get the supply on board, given the background of Brexit?
So it's very important that those issues are resolved, but there are a wide range of flexible technologies that can offer the solution there. Pumped hydro, as has been mentioned already, is a fantastic technology in Scotland, has a lot of potential applications. Interconnection, again, there is potentially a case for further interconnectors alongside other technologies that increase system flexibility. Those take time, but we would give the sort of reassurance that we're not expecting that to be an issue right now. We're very much in a state where system balancing is very effective, and we're not afraid of sort of things going wrong, but there is absolutely a case for investing in those technologies now, so that in 5-10 years' time, we're still able to give you that same guarantee of security of supply.
Okay, thanks very much.
I think Graham Simpson wanted to come with a very quick follow-up, please.
Yeah, thanks, conveners. Just a very quick follow-up to Sam. You mentioned hydro pump storage, and I just wondered whether you had any particular projects in mind.
Yes, fully cards on the table. We've got Corrie Glass, which is up in the Great Glens, which is a fantastic project. I mean, it could be sort of 200 times the energy storage capacity of the world's largest battery at the moment. It's a fantastic project. There'll be other developers with other ones, so I don't want to, pretend we're the only people in the world trying to develop this, but it could make a serious contribution to Scottish security of supply in that world post fossil fuel, unabated fossil fuels.
Is that just a project you've identified, Sam, or is there any work going on there? Or?
We've got a consent. So we actually have, it's basically sitting there effectively ready to go. The thing that it's waiting for is a revenue stabilization mechanism of some description, e.g. like you have with interconnectors, where it gives you a kind of cap and a floor on your revenue. So it's not beyond the wit of man to design something for it. There's some stuff pretty much off the shelf that you could tweak if you're sitting in government and Ofgem, but it does need that because the risk of doing it would be too high for you to build it without some sort of policy certainty, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
Colin Beatty.
I've been listening to a whole scattering of potential projects and potential things that could happen to push all this forward. But if we were going to bring it together, what are the major infrastructural improvements that are needed to support the supply chain? What are the major improvements? Anyone else?
Morag Watson.
I can't type the R fast enough in response to the questions there, hence the pause. It's a very important question, and as you know, in Scottish Renewables, supply chain is something that we pay a great deal of attention to. The key underpinning thing always for maintaining a robust supply chain is a pipeline of projects coming forward predictably and steadily. That is what businesses need to be able to invest. It's something that we've spoken at length to the UK government about around the fiscal mechanisms for both onshore and offshore renewables to ensure that this happens. We have very unfortunately in the past been very much a stop-start approach to these things, which is not beneficial for any business. So a predictable pipeline, what we are seeing around the world is there is a great deal of money out there looking for investment opportunities, and renewable energy and Scotland are seen as very good places to invest. So as you've said, we have no shortage of projects. We have no shortage of financial backers who are interested in doing them. The supportive policy context that we need to give those investors confidence is being put in place. There's still work to be done there. And once we get those financial mechanisms sorted out, and we expect to see many more projects coming forward in the Contracts for Difference auction round 4, which will happen later on this year, that is when we would really start to see things change.
Anyone else have a contribution on that?
Just briefly.
Okay.
Just briefly. Yeah, just briefly because I thought Maura put it fantastically. I think one I would say is it is happening. So take SSE's projects this year alone, the Sea Green project, which is off Firth of Forth, and our Viking wind farm on Shetland. We're creating 1,000 jobs this year in work on those projects. So some stuff is happening, but we're probably going to get to about 50% UK content for our Sea Green offshore wind farm, and to get that last 50%, which obviously is what we all want to get to, we're going to need to get some strategic investment in things like factories for blades, for towers, etc. That last part of the jigsaw is companies like mine will do our best to move those forward, but also UK government funding, Scottish government funding that can just help establish actual on the ground factories, I think is critical to just top up the final part of it.
Actually, Sam Peacock just leads me neatly on to my next question, actually, which is in connection with jobs. We hear lots of figures being produced as to how many thousand jobs are going to be created here, there and everywhere. And there's been a lot of analysis by National Grid, University of South Clyde, or Catapult. And they indicate there's upwards of 60,000 new jobs to be created. A lot of jobs. Are these estimates credible? Are they actually achievable?
Shall I start, Mr. Beatty?
Sure.
I need to look at the detail of that one. All I know is that for our own work, you have to put in, we measure it. So we get, for SSE as a whole, we get PwC to audit every year and work out our contribution and work out our jobs, direct and indirect, that we're able to generate. So that is done in a credible way. The number for Scotland that we've got is SSE contributed to 10,500 jobs last year, direct and indirect. And I can kick the committee on the figure so you've got that. I reckon it'll be even more this year as a result of what we've just talked about and those projects that we've got going. But for me, to really capturing these jobs in Scotland and the UK is the key feature now for the offshore industry over the next 10 years. We've started actually quite well, but we have more to do, and we need to get some of these factories for the critical components moving forward. We're trying to make that happen as SSE, but it will be companies, governments working together on that.
Over the years,
Charles Wood, I think Charles Wood, did you want to come in on some of these points?
Yes, please. So the core thing with jobs is it's absolutely very difficult for us to pinpoint exactly how many jobs are going to be in exactly what parts of the sector. But there is an estimate that the utilities sector as a whole will be looking for something like 270,000 jobs in the next 10 years. A fair proportion of those will be in Scotland, and the way in which you take those is completely based on what the sort of approach will be from Scotland. And this plan seems to put Scotland in a very good place in terms of not only the jobs that occur on offshore wind, but also in the supply chain for other elements. If you look at low carbon heat, the manufacturing supply chain there is of high potential for Scotland. If you look at the installers required for all of the various different technologies that are going into people's homes, again, that's an area where we need to help people recover from COVID, where the lockdown has prevented them from getting into people's homes, and to move into a sustainable sector. So reskilling, retraining, these are things that the energy industry is currently looking at in a lot of detail right now to try and figure out what number of jobs do we need, by what date, and the incremental targets that Scotland is putting in place are very helpful. But we do need to see more detail following the plan on how we're actually going to achieve those. What sort of dates and targets would you like to see in the sort of incremental next few years, next 5 years, next 10 years, so that we can plan for that and ramp up that supply chain of skilled workers. And just while I have you, I will mention a pumped hydro facility, Kirken. Sorry for my pronunciation if that's terrible, but it's in Argyll, and they're currently looking to expand. That would be around 200 jobs for the next 6 years, and around 500 million in investment being enabled. But it can't currently do that. So I just wanted to note that that's one example of a pumped hydro storage facility that currently needs a bit more clarity on planning and a bit more support from more central government support. So I wanted to answer 2 questions there in one.
Over the years, we've had an awful lot of estimates as to how many jobs the so-called green revolution will result in. In 2018, the low carbon electricity sector directly supported 7,800 full-time equivalent jobs across Scotland. And given the projections now, that's going to be exponentially increased. And you know, I asked a question as to whether that's actually credible. But on the back of that, touching on a point that was made just now, there's the question of training, skills and training. Where are the gaps in the electricity industry in this, in order that we can achieve net zero? And how are these being addressed?
I wonder, did Morag Watson want to come in at that point?
Absolutely, I can come in on that one. Basically, I just appear to have lost you all off my screen, but I will talk to a blank screen and hopefully get you back soon. So skills and skills transition is really important. In terms of jobs, I would go back to the previous point that I've made about a pipeline of projects. It is the projects that generate the jobs. So without the projects, the job numbers stay the same of the people who are employed at the moment. They don't expand in the way that we would want them to. On skills specifically, we are currently leading work with the Energy Skills Alliance, and we're looking into the number and types of jobs that there will be in the energy industry in 2021 and mapping those against the likely requirements out to 2030 and beyond. So it's high-level work, and it's necessary, so we equip Scotland with the world-class further and higher education systems that we're going to need to bring forward the right number of people with the right qualifications to come into the jobs that we're expecting to see coming forward. The other work that we're doing is through the Offshore Wind Industry Council, which is a UK level body, and the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, which is a Scotland specific body. They both have skills work streams, which are working to ensure that the companies who are working in the offshore sector and the supply chain have access to the skills that they're going to need now and in the future. and working with those supply chain companies to ensure that the skills are delivered ahead of need, so we're not running to catch ourselves up. And the final one is a study that we did recently of 18 to 34-year-olds in the UK to say that they actually want jobs in these kind of industries. 45% saying that they see sustainable sectors as offering the most secure career. And 6% said they specifically wanted a job in the fossil fuel industry, which is much lower than we've seen in the past. So the Scottish Government is doing a lot with its STEM strategy and the STEM Hub partnerships. They are a mechanism that's helping address these skills gaps that we will have. And the Renewable Energy Skills Centre of Excellence is something that we've called for to ensure that we are matching up the coming demand with supply. So it is a very active area of work for us all at the moment. It's something that we pay a great deal of attention to. Both industry will need the skills and we want to see more jobs in Scotland. So matching those two up to find a really productive way forward is the key priority in industry at the moment.
Can I ask, where actually are the gaps at the moment? Where are the pressures on resources and skills going in there?
This is one I pass over to Sam. Sam very much more involved in the employment end of the sector and the kind of skills that he would be looking for as a developer. So Sam, perhaps you can pick this one up.
Sure. I mean, it's a great question. To date, we've managed to do it. And we've managed to, there's some fantastic stories actually about people we've managed to get from oil and gas Scotland who got very, very useful infrastructure skills, which we've been able to then convert into renewables. To date, we've been quite effective at it, but I'm a bit worried about it. Speaking within SSE, there's a lot of, I don't know, let's say there's an older workforce who've been doing a lot of the work to date. And while we're seeing some younger people coming through, I think it's not quite at the pace I'd quite like to see, given we're trying to build an industry here for multiple decades. I think when I thought about this and when we've talked about it, I think the most useful thing from a political perspective is anything that the Scottish Government can do to help with retraining programs and help with skilling up in partnership with industry is absolutely critical to this and moving forward. As I said, we haven't had a huge crunch point. We've been able to do it to date, but when we think about the scale and the 11 gigawatts that we were talking about earlier, you know, we will run out of people pretty quickly. So ability to train people so that we don't end up having to go abroad for skills, I think would be fantastic.
We're talking about the Scottish Government and the initiatives that it should be taking. What more actually could it do? I mean, the Scottish Government's doing a great deal already through, as previously said, through STEM, through various other initiatives that they're trying to focus on to bring people on. What more could they do than they're not doing now, than they are doing now? What aren't they doing?
My perspective, I wouldn't be hugely critical at all in this area. There are some areas where, you know, I'm sitting there and I'm going, look, we need to do more on planning. We need to do more on grid charging, where you just sit there and you think we're not there yet. On this, I do think the Scottish Government has made serious efforts to try and help move this forward. And I think keep going, do more of it, and a particular focus, I think, on helping with retraining initiatives from oil and gas, which is already starting. Like, let's not pretend I'm the first person who said it. I'm not. But would really help, because you've got a world-leading offshore oil and gas industry, and we want to keep building a world-leading renewables industry. I think that's where some of the low-hanging fruit on training and skills can be got from, would be my view.
All right, thank you. I think I'm conscious of time, so I'd like to allow another couple of members, at least of the committee, to put their questions. So we'll come on now to Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Convener. Because of time, I'll shorten some of my questions. Morning, panel. It seems to take years from start to finish to set up various projects. So in regards to planning, what improvements should there be made to, and what efficiencies found in the consenting process to enable faster determination of applications and what are the risks to make these more efficient to speed them up? Morag.
I can certainly come in on that one. The biggest issue with planning that we have is it's the time it takes to get a consent and its unpredictability. Since we had a climate emergency declared, we've actually seen the number of renewable projects consented go down, not up. And in many cases, it's pretty much 50-50 as to whether consent is granted or not. So when the Scottish Government put out their call for ideas for a National Planning Framework 4, we spent a year working on that. It was the most comprehensive policy response that we have ever done as a body, and it extends to one major document and 6 supporting documents explaining exactly how we can improve the planning system around this. I will not take up the committee's time by going through all of that, but we can certainly provide it. So the key things that we need is that we need consistency. How planning policy is applied across authorities in Scotland varies widely, which brings great unpredictability. We need more efficiency. As I say, we're about 50-50, so it means there's a huge amount of work being done in the planning system that does not result in a project going forward, and that is not a great use of anybody's resources. And the other thing, as I said, is we just need more capacity. What we've seen, particularly during the current situation, is because staff in local authorities have been pulled onto other things, because people in Scottish Government have been pulled onto other things, paperwork will literally sit on someone's desk for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. And we've spoken very much about how renewable energy projects can really contribute to a green economic recovery. If they're stuck sitting on somebody's desk, that can't happen. So again, we have raised in our manifesto and through other channels of the Scottish Government about more capacity is going to be needed, particularly when we start looking at the levels of deployment that we will need going forward. It's going to be the case that more and more applications are going to come forward in a system that is already struggling to cope with current capacity. So that is a really, really big area of concern for us as an industry.
Can I say I totally agree with you in every comment you've made. What will the impact be of the delay to the National Planning Framework 4? And maybe to Morgan again, sorry.
Yes, of course. Again, this is something we're deeply concerned about. We do fully understand the impact of the current pandemic situation on us and absolutely support that the government needs to put some work on hold. But the length of delay in the NPF4 is a concern for us, that it won't come into place until 2022. So we would like to see that accelerated, or some interim policies put in place between now and then to support renewables coming forward. The two areas of concern is when we have the contracts for difference auctions, there will be one this year and one in 2 years' time, you must have your consents fully in place before you can bid in those auctions. The pace at which turbine technology changes is huge. If you think of the pace at which mobile phone technology is changing, that will give you an idea of just how quickly things move forward. So if you've got a consent that you got 3 years ago, by the time you come to build, it's very likely that the turbines you specified in your planning application are no longer available on the market, and a newer model is being put in place. In some cases, the planning authority will see that as a non-material change and it will get consented very quickly. In some cases, they will see it as a material change and they will want to reconsent the project. So that slows you down because you've already consented it, but you have to reconsent it with the technology that's available now. And this again is something that we've spoken at length to the Scottish Government about, that planning is not currently designed to keep up with the pace of technological change, which is only going to accelerate, not just in wind turbines, but in heat and transport and so on. And we need a system that can keep up with that.
Yeah, Convener, can I quickly ask Sam and or Charles to comment on my last question? Should the National Planning Framework 4 make climate change and achieving net zero emissions a material consideration in the planning process, which I agree must be speeded up? Sam or Charles?
Just one comment. Agree with everything Morag said, and she put it all far better than I could. And agree with your fundamental premise, Mr. Lyle. Two comments I'd make. One, the MPF4, understand why it's delayed, but anything can be done to sped up would be absolutely brilliant. In the meantime, it's maybe slightly wishful thinking, but if we could get some sort of direction for key planning decision makers so that we can get more of a presumption in favour of renewable related development, given the race against time to get some of these projects in for auctions would be fantastic. And I think one area that I didn't touch upon, although it's implied by some of the comments, is also on repowering of onshore wind, where ultimately in many cases we're going to need to do quite a bit of tinkering with sites in order to get newer turbines in there. And it would be good if we could have, obviously it's got to work for communities, that's an absolute given, but it's good if we could have a kind of fluent and relatively rapid planning process. But I guess I would say that, wouldn't I, developer?
Charles, you got a quick comment, if you wish, or not?
I'd echo what's been said by the previous speakers, but I would also note that you are completely right to raise that, and I think this climate change plan update is something that has helped to do that. It's pulling together a lot of different policy and regulation levers in order to best accelerate that transition to net zero, and making sure that planning is seen through the lens of, does this help us achieve net zero, is really critical. So I would agree with you on that comment.
Well, you've got a supporter. Well, I'm retiring in May, but I will support you as much as I can. Thank you, convener.
Thank you. And now, finally, the deputy convener, Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Gordon, and good morning to the panel. I just wanted to ask you for a few words about negative emissions technologies. And firstly, perhaps, Sam, you started as talking about that earlier on. Could you just tell us, for the benefit of people who might be watching this, what do we mean by negative emissions technologies, and where do they fit within the climate change plan?
Excellent, I'll start. Where do they fit? We haven't got them at the moment. So at the moment, all the things we've been talking about so far are zero emissions technologies like renewable. Even things that we think are absolutely critical to the system, like carbon capture and storage, and our plans at Peterhead, which I should have said earlier, we think we could do by the mid-2020s if given a fair run. So we could get Peterhead moving pretty quickly. But even that has some residual emissions. Carbon capture and storage has a small amount of residual emissions with it. So for our energy system, electricity system to be pure negative, we will need things like biomass, which is then captured and stored. The carbon's captured and taken out of it instead of fossil fuel as the fuel, using biomass or some sort of biofuel. Or we'll need to do something which is really stretching my knowledge around direct air capture, taking carbon dioxide out of the air and turning into something else, which is clearly not my specialist subject, as you can tell from that descriptor. But we're not moving fast enough on those ones. I think Charles knows more about this area than me, but at the moment we've been focusing on those zero or very, very small emissions technologies as a company, but I know that others in the sector are looking at further some of those. But I think Charles is probably the best person on the panel.
Right. Okay, Charles?
So in terms of the technologies that already exist, it is that focus on capturing carbon that's in the air currently, or capturing carbon that's being produced as part of a process. So biomass in particular, there is a plant run by Drax that operates a small carbon capture technology to pull some of that carbon in. The next 12 to 24 months in particular are really critical to those technologies and to their development. So it's really welcome to see the Emerging Energy Technologies Fund for 180 million and the Carbon Capture and Utilisation Challenge Fund from 2022. Those will be really critical in supporting that industry, pushing things forward a little and getting them past that sort of technology readiness level at which they can be pushed out at scale. I think that within the Scottish journey towards net zero, carbon capture will absolutely, and negative emission technologies will absolutely be part of the mix. What exactly that mix of technologies and options will be, from everything from planting trees and peatlands to putting carbon capture into various parts in cities in order to capture directly from the air. Whatever this mix of solutions will be is uncertain. but the next 2 years in particular, and that funding that's already been announced, will be really critical to pushing that forward.
Do you think it's realistic, though, to expect these technologies to be, planned and developed and operational by 2029? I mean, that's only 8 years away. We've kind of lost a year even because of the COVID situation. So is it realistic to expect that, and the huge target reduction that we seem to have set ourselves is at 376% by 2032? Is it realistic that we're going to get there in this timescale, do we think?
I feel that question is increasingly difficult to answer, because the ability to get there just depends on how much money we spend. How quickly we can move on decarbonisation depends on how much money we're willing to spend. If we can create the right market frameworks and we can state that carbon capture technologies will be of value in 2029, the industry will meet that. The industry will create, we will invest in research and development, we will invest in these technologies, and we will deliver that. The times, yes, it's ambitious, but we just simply don't have any other choice.
Mm-hmm. And what about, balancing the risks and the benefits, between government, industry and consumers? Are we clear about that, about who does what, who gets what, who contributes what? Are we clear about that framework, do you think, Charles?
Not in the slightest. There are a lot of questions being asked right now, and central governments look at who should pay, and some of the questions around the net zero transition and how you fund that is very much that. It's a series of questions, it's a series of potential options and ways that could be worked around. But I think Scottish Government is actually doing very well in this area, in terms of firstly having that clear consumer engagement plan that was published with the plan, and the need to consistently sort of get consumers on side, get them to understand what the purpose is, the societal benefits, the economic benefits of decarbonisation. Secondly, a lot of the things that will answer that question are coming from existing work streams. We've already talked about network charging. We've talked about a few of the different things that are happening that are very complex that will help us to answer that question. One thing I would note is it's really important for this plan and for that question to be asked repeatedly and to be examined repeatedly. And we actually think as Energy UK that this committee should have a role in that. It should be a matter of Scottish Government being held to account for if they are delivering, if they have answered questions, if they are supporting consumers who need that support in order to transition. And that should happen on at least yearly, but hopefully twice a year, for this committee to ask those questions to see how much progress has been made, and if those core questions about how are you going to protect consumers from bearing the brunt of the cost of transition should be asked by this committee, should be asked regularly.
Thank you for that. And maybe just a final query, maybe to Morag and Sam. Do you think Scotland's got the capability to compete in this whole sector? We know that in Denmark and Norway there's some good expertise in this technology there, but do you think we're well placed enough to compete and to deliver successful industry in this area for Scotland?
Morag, Watson, then Sam.
Sure. Just waiting for the mic to come on there. Absolutely, without a doubt. So Scotland's renewable energy resource is the best in Europe. We are exceptionally well placed. We can generate way more energy than we would ever need to meet our own resources and our own needs many, many times over. We're already seeing Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium looking to Scotland. They do not have enough renewable energy resource to power themselves. They look to us. As we've already touched on, the expertise in the North Sea from the oil and gas industry is world class. If you can engineer energy projects in the northern North Sea and the conditions it throws at you, you can do it anywhere in the world. And we are seeing that those skills in subsea engineering and moorings and pipelines and the handling of gas all are very transferable. We've seen with our members that they're already working on every continent around the world, with the exception of Antarctica, on energy projects, 72 different countries around the world, and there's a a standing joke that if you go to a wind farm project in China, you'll always hear a Scottish accent somewhere on the site. So yes, we are extremely well placed. We will always say that more needs to be done in policy, but actually the Scottish policy context is one of the most supportive in the world. As you say, more can be done around planning and all the things we've talked about today. But yes, would be the short answer to that. We are extremely well placed to do this.
Anything to add to that, Sam, or can we just take it as that's enough?
Very, very briefly, comparative advantage of Scotland is huge. And I would just say one thing that links to your previous question, shut up, is just that if we can get carbon capture and storage going at Peterhead and get carbon capture and storage pipelines going at some other areas in Scotland, you can then get other industry to plug in. It then is much easier to get, if you have those anchor projects underpinning, a carbon dioxide pipeline, it's then much easier to start to getting other industry to start taking their emissions out, plugging it into that pipeline. So in theory, if we start to get that sort of thing going by the middle of this decade, then that 2029 comment you made earlier starts to look a bit better.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Back to you, convener.
Thank you very much to our panel of witnesses. And if you do want to add to any of the comments you've made today, and if there are further information on any of the issues that have been raised here, please feel free to write into the committee. So thank you very much for your appearance today. I will bring this session to a close and suspend the meeting briefly until planned return at 10:25 for committee members' information. Thank you very much. Good morning and welcome back to our meeting and the second panel for our consideration of the climate change plan. Now, we have three witnesses who I would like to welcome. Chris Stark, Chief Executive for the Committee on Climate Change, Julian Leslie, who is the Head of Networks and Chief Engineer at the National Grid, ESO, and Stephen McMahon, who is the Deputy Director, Electricity Distribution and Cross-Sector Policy for Ofgem. If I might just say to our witnesses, if you just give a few seconds to allow the broadcasting colleagues to bring you in when a question is put to you. Don't feel that you need to answer every question, and indeed we won't have time because of time limitations to perhaps cover all points you might like to, but do feel free to write in after today's session if points arise that you felt you would have liked to have responded on, or you have further information that you might feel is helpful to the committee. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll start with questions from committee member Graham Simpson.
Yeah, thanks, convener, and hello to the second panel. You'll have heard the questions that we asked earlier. So my first question is broadly similar to the one I asked right at the start of the first session, and it relates to the level of energy consumption that should come from renewables. And you'll recall that I asked what needs to happen to achieve the 2030 target of 50% of energy consumption coming from renewables. So that would be my first question, and if in the interest of speed, if I just throw another one in, and you can answer this at the same time. I'm just wondering what you think should be the proportion of the energy system that should be in local or community ownership, and by which I mean district heating. This committee's been dealing with the Heat Networks bill, so that's quite pertinent. So a couple of questions there rolled into one. Thank you.
Who would like to start? And if you want to come in at any point, please just type R in the chat box if you can. So I don't know who would like to respond first of all. Chris Stark, perhaps?
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. And thanks so much for inviting me to join you this morning. So I'm on the question of renewable capacity and what can be achieved. A few comments from me and my organisation, and I just wanted to say at the start that I think the Scottish Government should be congratulated for their ambition here. It's been great to have Scotland with that kind of consistent support for renewables along the way for the last 10 to 15 years, and that has made a difference across the UK. In the CCC, we make regular assessments of what kind of energy system we might need across the UK. For that net zero world that we are now committed to in Scotland and for the UK. And it's worth saying that we see renewable electricity very much as the backbone of the whole energy system. So that's a particular benefit as we electrify the economy, because you can clean up the supply using particularly renewable electricity. In our latest UK-wide recommendations, 80% of total generation of electricity by 2050 would be from renewables in our central pathway. And that's complemented by various things along the way, so you have a workable system. So to deliver that kind of ambition of 50% of total energy from renewables, we're going to have to grow the installed base of renewable supply in the UK and in Scotland. The Crown Estate has already leased seabed rights for enough offshore wind for the UK government's commitment of 40 gigawatts by 2030. So we've got enough space to do offshore wind to supply that kind of increase in supply. We've also got space to do lots of onshore wind here in Scotland. That's all very important because we're predicting that demand for electricity will grow significantly over the coming years. But it's a bit more than just needing more generation capacity, which is the key point I wanted to make in my answer, that we think that not only do we need to grow that capacity, we also need to do a set of other things to the wider energy system. We need to strengthen the networks, electricity networks in particular, to accommodate all that new demand that we'll have for heat and for transport. We'll also need increased flexibility in the way that we use that electricity so that we can increasingly accommodate that very, we think, cheap variable renewable supply that we'll have for heat and for transport, including potentially things like hydrogen electrolysis as a means of storing energy from renewables. So going back to your question, our recommendation really is that the Scottish Government thinks about the whole system, and they appear to have done that in this climate change plan. So that 50% target will be met by more than just growing the number of wind farms that we have in Scotland and Scottish waters. We also need to think about the wider energy system and how it's used.
Thank you. And Julian Leslie, and then Stephen.
Yeah, good morning. It's great to be here, and thank you for the invitation. The decarbonisation of heat is going to require a whole host of solutions, I think, depending on the locality as to where the housing is, the networks that are available to it. So I think that whole sector coordination, sort of pulling that together to make sure that all options are kept on the table. It's not just an electricity solution, it's not just a decarbonised gas solution. All of those solutions are going to be relevant and important, depending on the particular housing stock and the location as to where it is. In terms of the transmission system, we have over a doubling of contracts with new generation, which is due to connect between now and 2030. Again, increasing the 12 gigawatts of transmission connected generation we have in Scotland today, and increasing that to well over 20 gigawatts in the next 10 years. And the relevant sort of transmission network that goes along with that. So you can see that developers have the commitments, they've made the contractual commitments and securing those projects. Obviously, they still need to go through planning, they'll need to get through the contract for difference processes, etc. But the ambition is there, the plans are there, and the developers are coming forward with those projects to make this all achievable by 2030.
Stephen?
Okay, thanks, convener. Again, thanks for inviting me to be here today. I'd probably just echo the points that Chris and Julian have made. I think if you look back over the past decade, it's clear that there's been significant progress made in Scotland in particular through the decarbonisation of the power sector and the amount of energy that's coming from renewable and low carbon sources. I think there's quite a big challenge ahead. I think if you're going to meet some targets for offshore wind, and I think in Ofgem we're looking at how do we get the networks and the coordination between offshore and onshore so the grids can accommodate that. I think that's one thing. Decarbonisation of heat, again, just looking at the range of possibilities that we have there through hydrogen or other resources. And I think probably the last thing, and picking up on the flexibility point, is just around recognising that we will be moving to probably a more disaggregated and decentralised energy system. So there'll be growing amounts of local generation that will be connecting directly to the distribution grids in particular. How do we make sure that we maximise the opportunities that they afford and help keep costs lower overall? So those are the key things that I would say from an Ofgem perspective.
Stephen, I just want to pick up on your comment on local generation, because that was the second part of my question. And I just wonder how you think we can actually boost the numbers of local projects.
I think there's a range of ways that we can do that. I think through our regulation, it's making sure that we've got the right investment in place and capacity in the right places that allow it to happen, making sure there's the right incentives as well. Looking at some of the potential opportunities that this affords, like for the network operators in terms of keeping their overall cost low. So there's a number of opportunities, and I think if you look at the last few years in particular, it's something that the networks have been successful on doing, and there's a strong platform to build on there. And I think that these things offer massive opportunity. I think that engaging with stakeholders, I think that's a key thing. I'll lead Ofgem's work on the electricity distribution grids. There's going to be lots of local options that are coming forward, and we're making sure that there's the right processes in place for these opportunities to be maximised, I think is absolutely critical.
If we could just ask another follow-up to that, convener. I represent central Scotland, and that includes Grangemouth. You'll all be aware of Grangemouth. The Grangemouth town itself doesn't have a district heating scheme. You think where it is next to that, massive sort of refinery almost. It almost seems absurd, but it doesn't have it because of the cost of putting one in. And so, is there, what needs to be done? Does this need to be led by government to get district heating schemes into existing communities? It's a lot easier to put them in new places, but in existing places, it's very, very expensive and very difficult. Stephen?
I think, yeah, I mean, the decarbonisation of heat is a big challenge. I think some of the potential costs involved are significant. So the trade-offs, I think, are significant in terms of looking at like the consumer impact. I think that's something that we want to work with government and other stakeholders on, just to look at the range of potential technologies that we've got, whether that be district heating schemes or alternatives, just to make sure that these have got a real opportunity of being realised.
Chris Stark wants in.
Yeah, it was just to, I mean, firmly agree with the premise of your question. So a place like Grangemouth with lots of waste industrial heat is exactly where you would want to see a district heating network constructed, because that heat can be used then to very, very efficiently heat the town. I think there are a set of factors in place that have made that difficult. One of them is that there has been, over time, there hasn't been the kind of regulatory system in place that would allow you to easily construct that district heating network in the way that we've been able to construct the gas networks. The other things that are in play here are that gas itself is a very cheap source of heat. So as a fuel, it's the cheapest among all the options. So that's been a matter of policy and a direction of policy, and that's of course a very helpful thing for fuel poverty, but not a very helpful thing for decarbonisation. So as we think about the future, we're going to have to construct a different set of incentives here to make the alternatives cheaper. And for a place like Grangemouth, it is absolutely right that we should be putting the pipes in the ground that allow a district heating network to be constructed so that you can have that cheap decarbonised heat available in that town, as you find on the continent in many towns and cities as well. Now, that requires a bit of coordination from the Scottish Government ends, because there's a lot of planning concerns here. There's a need for a well worked through process here. I would suggest it also needs changes in policy at UK level, including notably the change potentially in the tax rates that are applied to the various sources of energy across the fossil fuels and the alternatives.
I would be interested, I won't ask another question, Convener, but I would be interested in a few more thoughts on that, because that is an enormous frustration for certainly Falkirk Council and others, that we've got a town there where there is fuel poverty, but it's sitting next to a facility where there is a lot of waste heat. It does seem absurd to me that we can't do anything. So I think, Chris, if you were able to come back to us, don't answer that question now because it's very detailed, on what needs to happen to get that project to happen, because people want it to happen, but there are barriers in the way. So I'll leave it there, Convener. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I would like to ask a few questions. I mean, you've talked about a great ambition, and I think we can all agree that positive ambition is a good thing. But just wondering how realistic I think at the minute there's 740 megawatts of offshore wind planned or being installed. So is it realistic to expect this to increase so significantly to 2030, up from to 8 to 11 gigawatts, I think it is. And my question is, the Climate Change Committee has recommended the Scottish Government calculate how much renewable low carbon generation is required to meet net zero in Scotland, and also to contribute cost effectively to net zero. And I think the draft CCP climate change plan expects the development of between 11 and 16 gigawatt of capacity within its lifetime. So, I mean, does the Scottish Government, has it committed, or is the funding, is the planning in the works to actually meet some of these expectations, which are very ambitious, as you've said? And then the second thing is, what installed capacity of renewable energy is Ofgem and the National Grid actually planning for? And I think Steve's already touched on this about decarbonising heating and transport. So that's perhaps more a question for him, the question about how much is actually being planned for in terms of Ofgem and national grid for installed or increased electricity capacity from renewable energy. So those are the two questions, and I think, did Julian Leslie indicate he'd like to come in on that? So Julian, first of all.
Great, thank you for that. So as I said earlier, there's huge ambition from the marketplace to drive the connections out to 2030. And already we have over 7 gigawatts of offshore wind signed up, ready to go, with plans that the transmission owner and the developer has in place in order to facilitate that. We are also looking at working on an offshore coordinated, integrated solution, which is going to drive down costs for consumers and hopefully accelerate the delivery of this integrated offshore as well. So working very closely with BEIS and with Ofgem to look at the regulatory and regime requirements that are required in order to facilitate this integrated offshore solution. So in terms of meeting the 11 gigawatts by 2030, it is ambitious. There's a lot to do. We've got regulatory change to be made, and then there's all of the planning and then the funding and the mechanisms to make that happen. However, from where we sit today, we are absolutely planning for the connections that we see already, and we're planning for the future to really meet both Scottish Government ambition, but also the UK Government ambition of 40 gigawatts by 2030. So we have the plans in place. The recent price controls have given a bit of certainty to the transmission owners that the investment that they require is there, and the mechanisms to access that funding is also there to enable the future sort of grid that we need to get us to 2030.
Thank you. And Stephen, what are your comments on these issues?
I think just on the question of how we plan, I think we plan on the basis of the climate change ambitions that are set out by government. I think as Julian described, I mean, there's a range of scenarios that we use and pathways to the delivery of these targets. So we account for that uncertainty in our own systems and processes. I think what we do recognise is that across the UK, like the targets that have been set for offshore wind in particular will require a step change in the way that the offshore generation and transmission is planned, how it's developed, how it's connected. And I think by doing this, and having these systems in place, it allows us to build on the success achieved so far. I think increased capacity that is required to deliver net zero, whilst at the same time, and it's key to our statutory objective, is making sure that we can keep the cost to consumers as low as we possibly can. So that's an ongoing process that we work with government, we work with industry and other stakeholders to make sure we've got the right regulatory approaches in place that do allow that expansion at lowest cost.
Thank you. And perhaps Chris Stark, if you want to comment briefly on these points.
Yes, of course. I mean, going back to your earlier question, we recommended that the Scottish Government set out a new assessment of just how much capacity and renewables they think would be required for net zero Scotland by 2045. I think this plan it does do that, and it's certainly ambitious. The growth over the next 10 years that they're projecting is achievable, but is certainly at the upper end of what I think will come through. I mean, I think a few things to say on that. I mentioned already, I think the scope is there to grow the installed base of offshore wind hugely. And even if you look at what's already been leased and what could be leased in Scotland and what could be leased across the UK, there's so much scope there. Little factoid for you, we reckon that less than 1% of the seabed will be used by offshore wind to meet that 2030 target that the Prime Minister has set. So, you know, there's plenty of scope there. But the kind of bigger challenge for me is what you do alongside that growth in capacity for offshore wind. So, you know, the scope to do it quickly is there too amongst the developer community, as long as the policy is there to support it. So from my perspective, just to draw it together, the ambition from the Scottish Government is great. I've made that point. It is in line with what we think would be needed to get to net zero for Scotland. But there are still big gaps in how it would actually be delivered in practice. So that's a shared question, a shared issue for Scottish ministers and ministers in Whitehall. So we need energy consenting in the national planning framework in Scotland to be well aligned. So the new national planning framework has been delayed until the autumn, so there's a few months of delay there can make a big difference in some of these projects. And then we need the UK government to make sure that the market mechanisms are in place for the developer community to be rewarded for the investments that they need to make. And you'll see the blueprint for that in the recent UK Energy White Paper. But it's another one of those areas where you've got a lot of consultations happening, CFD consultations ongoing. You've got a next round of contract for differences and options to be done later this year. So there's still a few things that need to be put in place. But I must say, when I look across the whole of the Scottish Government's plans, this is one of the better and more fully formed bits of it. So this is something I have fairly strong confidence will come through.
All right, thank you very much. We now move to questions from Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Convener. In the panel's thoughts on transmission and distribution, I know Chris Stark has already highlighted this in earlier today. Clearly, the Scottish TOs have published business plans. I'm interested in the panel's views on security of supply as well as cost to the consumer. We heard in an earlier evidence session that the potential cost to the consumer is less than £10, approximately £7 on an annual basis. So I'm keen to hear about security of supply, thoughts on consumer cost and key priorities for this investment. Julian.
Yes, thank you. So in terms of security of supply, it's something we all take very seriously between ourselves and the ESO, looking on a GB-wide basis in conjunction with the two Scottish transmission owners. We did an initial report in 2015-16 looking at Scotland's security post a nuclear sort of closure and with a massive increase in renewables. And there's some investments that the Scottish TOs needed to make at that point, which are now coming on stream as we speak in order to bolster the security in Scotland. We are looking at that analysis again, as we always do. We're constantly under review, so we're now looking sort of towards the back end of this decade, sort of 2025 to 2030, just to go back around that process, just to make sure that nothing has changed and we are secure. So that work is going to complete towards the end of March this year, which again will give us that clear blueprint for security of supply out to 2030. Alongside that, though, we do need new tools on the system in order to operate safe and securely. So things like our stability pathfinders for grid stability and inertia. As you lose the sort of big rotating mass on the machines, we need to replace those services with other techniques. And we are running a Scotland-specific process right now, which we should be contracting with new technology providers by the summer of this year, delivering sort of 2023, 2024, which will provide these new services, new technologies on the system that provide us that real stable grid system. So even in very, very low or very high wind conditions of the system. So the way that this process works in terms of analysing and tracking that investment, obviously the business plans that the two TOs have put in what the transmission owners know in conjunction with the system operator. But again, we run an annual process called the Network Optioneering Assessment Process, which is doing this annual review as to what is the right investment to be made at the right time. And as we go through the next few years, as we start going through the business plan, we'll be already identifying activities that need to happen in RIIO 4 and RIIO 5, which are the next price controls, sort of following the one that's just been agreed. Because it takes 10 years plus to build some of these big transmission assets. And therefore, we are really planning now for the early 2030s. And the network we're going to have in the 2020s is already designed. The business plan that the TOs has the funding in order to deliver.
Thanks, Julian. Just a quick follow-up. Obviously, in Scotland, we have the TOs, and it's slightly different mechanism for working than in the rest of the UK. Previously, when I worked at Ofgem, there was SO and TO incentive working group to ensure efficient working together. I was just wondering if you could give us an update on how efficient you can work here in Scotland to improve grid connections and improve distribution.
Yeah, so the regime changed just a year and a half ago. So now the relationship between the system operator and all the TOs across Britain is the same. So we're legally separate from any transmission owner. So the mechanisms and the processes that we have in place between ourselves and the TOs are identical across Britain. The roles that we play as a system operator in joining this together, looking strategically, making sure that actions in one TO don't adversely affect another, and getting them to work together, and all 3-4 parties working consistently and clearly to drive the best value for consumer. That's what the network optioneering assessment process does. It ensures that any investment that's made by any of the TOs for these big boundary transfer capabilities is done at the right time in the right way, and is joined up with all of the other investment plans that are happening across the network.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Stephen, we'll come to you next.
Yeah, I think in terms of this relates to real price controls, obviously for transmission and the electricity system operator. In December, we confirmed the spending plans for these price controls. They come into effect in April this year, so it's coming up quite soon. I think there's probably around about £5 billion upfront investment for the Scottish TOs that's included in that, and that's for projects where we are fairly certain on the scope of the works that are needed and their cost. I think the other big dynamic that is new in these new set of price controls is the fact that there is the availability of more funding as and when required. So some of these big strategic projects that can support net zero over time, there is mechanisms in place that allow them to be delivered through the pipeline process as and when they're required, and in a way that reflects just how things are changing in the wider energy system. I think at the heart of that, we've been absolutely clear that that should give the network operators the resources they need to deliver net zero, to support the new demands that are being placed on the grids, as well as maintaining high levels of reliability and security of supply. I mean, the day-to-day management of security of supply is obviously a responsibility for Julian and the system operator, but we make sure that those regulatory arrangements are in place. In terms of the consumer impact, I think broadly speaking, we are saying that through the RIIO-2 period for transmission, we will support more investment for the same costs to consumers in terms of the bill impact. There's a bit of variation just in terms of where the costs are realised, but by and large, it's giving you more investment to support net zero at the same cost. And we've been able to do that, I think, by just pushing down on the operating and financing costs, I think, for the network companies in line with current market conditions, but at the same time allow that additional investment that is going to be required. The distribution side, so that's the price controls that I'm leading on. They're obviously starting 2 years later in April 2023, so we set out our methodology for that and the approach to strategic investment just before Christmas in December, and we'll get the company spending plans that will come in draft from the summer, and then there's a process through which we will set the arrangements in place. But again, it'll be very agile, looking at the challenges in net zero and the decarbonisation, the distribution side are significant, particularly from a transport and heat perspective, so making sure that we've got the right arrangements in place for those controls.
Thank you, Stephen. Just a quick follow-up. In the earlier session today, we heard some consternation about the charging regime, and particularly around the cost reflectivity of that, clearly if you're generating further up north, then you pay more because that's reflective of the cost which you're imposing on the system. Given net zero and given the areas where we as a United Kingdom would like to expand is now in those more remote areas, reflections on whether Ofgem should look at TNUoS and the charging regime?
Yeah, I heard the session from earlier. I think charging reform is obviously a key part of our programme at Ofgem. I think there's always going to be areas of disagreement, but I think we're always open and transparent. We've got a robust process in place through consultations, industry engagement to make sure that we can consider the wide range of stakeholders and reflect that in our approach. I think with transmission charging, it's not my area of expertise, but I think the key point is that they are equal and opposite, so it's a zero-sum game. One side pays more, then the other pays less, so looking at that balance between generators and consumers. Ultimately, what we're looking to do is try and incentivise smarter, more cost-effective use of the system from those connecting to it, so including the generators and energy-intensive users. We want renewable generators to connect to the grid where there's spare capacity. I think that avoids us having to build expensive extra grid capacity where it might not be needed. And I think that enables us to make best use of the asset that we've already got available to us. So it's about fairness, and it's about the efficiency of the system overall. And if we don't follow that path, then we end up with substantially more expensive system costs, and that's not a good outcome for consumers just in terms of the way these charges are recovered.
Thank you, Stephen. Chris Stark.
Yeah, just worth saying that the shape of the energy system that we've sketched out in the most recent assessments that we've done of net zero is quite clear, actually. It rests largely on progressively electrifying the economy and, of course, cleaning up the supply of that electricity over time. So the big point here in terms of security of supply and the consumer is that we're going to need to grow not just the supply. The point I made earlier, we also need to grow the demand for electricity through especially electrified heat and electrified transport. And by mid-century across the UK, we're expecting that demand for electricity will double, but at least double, so potentially even more than that. So the kind of rule of thumb in the way that we've been looking at that challenge in the CCC is that we should try whenever we can to match or to use rather variable renewables. So, especially offshore wind, but also some onshore wind and lots of solar too, because that's the cheapest form of generation. But of course, it's quite a different electricity system from what we have now. So key thing is to match the supply with the demand and to minimise the amount of network reinforcement if you want to keep the consumer costs low. And overall, we see that is something that's perfectly achievable, but it does rest on that idea of making best use of the grid and also crucially having a much more flexible source of demand, which you get from greater use of heat pumps, which are a nice match for when offshore wind is available, and much greater use of electric vehicle, especially if you're charging that with a tariff that's off peak. It gives you the incentives to use that electricity when it's off peak. So that's really, really critical. There's kind of 4 elements in our analysis that really make all that work. The first of them is the one we've talked a little bit about, but demand, which will double, of course, but energy efficiency is the thing that goes with that. So thinking about demand and energy efficiency, being as energy efficient as possible. Secondly, using variable renewables as much as possible. We're up to 80% now of total supply in our central pathway by mid-century, because it's the cheapest option, providing that big supply of electricity. Thirdly, we do need some firm power. So in our assessment, that's nuclear power, and that's of course not going to be in Scotland in the future, but we've got that in our assessment for the GB system. And then the last 2 things that we have in terms of security supply that really matter, one is dispatchable generation, which of course needs to be decarbonised as well. So that complements variable renewables, in particular gas with carbon capture and storage, which is something that features strongly in this plan from the Scottish Government. And then lastly, that point about flexibility and storage. That's the kind of 4th element of a workable electricity system in a net zero world. So we think that the cost of integrating much more flexibility and quite a lot of short and medium term storage is actually quite low in the grand scheme of things. So overall, that energy system is actually quite cheap, despite and that's a decarbonised energy system. If we can build in that flexibility that we've been talking about and minimise the amount of network reinforcement that we need to do.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, convener.
Thank you, and we'll now move to questions from Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, convener. And just to continue the earlier discussion with Stephen regarding the recent Ofgem changes, we heard from the earlier panel that there are no shortage of projects and no shortage of investors, but there are a number of blockages in the system, and one of them is connection charges and the other one is transmission charges. Now, your targeted charging review that was introduced in December 2020, it says the cost of operating, maintaining and upgrading the electricity grid will be spread more fairly. Can you maybe expand on what that actually means in reality? And that's to Stephen. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, thanks. Yeah, I can do it. And probably just the other point that I would pick up on, just based on the previous session, I think was Morag's point, that we understand the complexity in governance arrangements around network charging, and it can be very difficult to engage with. So we are working closely with stakeholders in Scotland to help them navigate some of these complexities, and there's various forums that are set up to help us do that. I think the key point around the fairness, so it's about like the fairness across the consumer base in terms of how these are recovered. I mean, this transmission charges are recovered across the whole of GB, and we want to remove distortions that might be in place between like generators and the balance between consumers and generators overall. So it goes back to that zero-sum game point. So like if someone's paying less, then someone else has to pay more. So for us, it's about that fairness overall and what delivers the greatest value to consumers, whilst also making sure that we're achieving our broader ambitions. So I think that's the key point. There is a number of issues that I think have been raised, like around specific points on this TCR process. I think there's challenge processes that are obviously underway on that, and we'll reflect carefully, I think, on any of them that do come forward and see if that has an impact in terms of those decisions that we've taken previously.
But given that the concern is that where generation is connected to the grid and is further away from major population centres, they get charged more. When you're saying that operating and maintaining and upgrading the grid will be spread more fairly, what impact will it have on Scottish transmission charges and connection charges? Will they be reducing if it's going to be a more fair and equitable charging regime?
I think overall, yes. I think there is benefit to consumers. So if we keep these system costs low, we keep these charges low, then there will be benefits to consumers. And I think there is net benefits overall from the decisions that we've taken.
Okay, thank you. And to Julian, I wanted to ask the question regarding how robust the system is against fluctuations and interruptions to supply. I wonder, given the fact that the UK regularly imports electricity from the EU, at times up to 15%.
Sure. I mean, I think in terms of energy supply, we have a very diverse mix of energy sources, which does include interconnectors. But we also have something called the capacity mechanism, which ensures that there is always enough dispatchable generation to meet whatever the scenarios can throw at us. So as we go through the winter, if there's a shortage of supply, then phase through the capacity mechanism, contract with enough generation to meet the demand on the system. So there is always enough dispatchable generation available for us to meet those demand periods when the wind is low.
But there has been power cuts in recent years, hasn't there, south of the border?
There was an incident on August 9th, 2019, where there was a fault on the system, and in order to protect the whole system, 1 million consumers were lost for 40 minutes. So that is true, but that was a rare and unprecedented event where two things happened simultaneously that you wouldn't normally expect to happen. And there's been a lot of actions, as you might imagine, since August 9th to ensure that we fully understand what happened on that day, and that we put processes in place with generators to ensure that they're always operating in a safe and secure way. So our network is the most resilient in the world and continues to do so. And as we look forward to the future, as we decarbonise further through the electricity system operators' work on pathfinders and identifying the new services and products that we need in order to manage the system as it becomes more renewable and less reliant on fossil fuels, then we're in good shape in order to meet that. And certainly our ambition of being able to operate the system at zero carbon by 2025 is only 4 years away, and we're making great progress in contracting with the service providers and technologies that will enable us to operate at zero carbon.
Okay, and my final point, and we'll start off with Chris, is the revised climate change plan has been welcomed by most witnesses this morning. However, it's not all in the gift of the Scottish Government. There is things that the UK Government have to deal with, and particularly favourable market conditions and incentives to support investment. Now, Chris, you already mentioned the need for financial incentives. Is there anything else that we have to examine in order for the UK Government in order to get the renewables that we require up and running in Scotland?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I think there is a package of things in the recently published UK Energy White Paper, which I think are really worth considering. And, you know, that is another blockbuster strategy document from government. So it's not just the Scottish Government that's been producing these massive tomes. That's another big one. And it's got within it a blueprint for actually quite a different set of market mechanisms right across the piece to deliver that kind of flexible zero carbon energy system that we've been talking about in this session. So I think all of that is going to be valid, and of course that needs to be valid for the discussion in this committee. Rather, that needs to be dovetailed with the discussion of what in Scotland needs to happen around it, particularly energy consenting and the national planning framework. And that some of the ambition in this plan is great, but some of the projects need to be developed at breakneck speed. So all of this needs to come together in such a way that market mechanisms are there, in particular for the new CFD, as it's known, the Contract for Difference for power generation, for hydrogen generation, which we haven't talked about. There's a plan there in the Energy White Paper, also for carbon capture and storage, which will be essential for some of the ambitions in the Scottish Government's Climate Change Plan update. That's got to be brought together with ministers in which projects to consent and where they'll be located. So all of that can be done, but at the kind of speed that the Scottish Government want it to happen, in single-digit years, you need to see commercial projects developed against that framework, that new framework that we don't yet know what it will look like. Is pretty ambitious. So I think there's going to be a real need to strain the sinews of the relationships between Scottish Government and Whitehall to make sure that all works well if we're going to make the kind of targets that ministers in the Scottish Government's plan have set.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener.
All right, thank you. We now move to Colin Beatty.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to go through a couple of points that are really very important to me, and if the witnesses were listening to the previous panel, they will have heard them already. The first is a fairly straightforward one. I hear lots of different initiatives and projects and so forth, but what are the major infrastructural improvements that are needed to support the supply chain? What are the major improvements to be done? Any volunteers?
I'm happy to come in from an Ofgem perspective. I think for us, if you look at the big strategic challenges that we've got, you've got the offshore wind. So how do we facilitate that growth in offshore wind and make sure you get the proper coordination between the offshore and onshore networks? As someone said earlier, at the moment you've got these point-to-point connections. I think that's something that needs to be massively improved. On the more local grids, the distribution grids, like how do we have like the charging infrastructure, the capacity that can support like the rapid rollout of electric vehicles without compromising reliability? I think on heat, you're looking at electrification at heat in some cases, or like can we like demonstrate that hydrogen is possible, it's safe and it's economically viable? Like these are a huge range of different system challenges that we're facing, and making sure that we've got the investment that can support their growth, we've got the pipeline of projects that can materialize over time, and the investment, I think, in innovation and R&D. Like that's probably something that sits at the heart of our program. So how can we, where the technologies are a little bit more uncertain, how can we invest now to see and test them to see how viable they can be? And that's something that we put unlimited funding on for the next set of price controls. And all of these things should give stability, I think, on the pathways and the projects themes that are coming forward, and the supply chain should be able to react to that with the companies.
Okay. What about Julian Leslie? Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, so I think the thing that really drives the supply chain is certainty. So whether it's certainty around planning, certainty around any sort of subsidy mechanism for the transmission owners, certainty around the funding and the needs cases. So I think having plans which really drive that certainty, that people can start to invest ahead now. As I said earlier, we've got 7 gigawatts of contracts ready and waiting to go to be developed. But whether they will actually be developed depends on a whole range of things come into place, from planning, subsidies, and all those other things. And once you get those certainties, then the supply chain will build and develop and create that pipeline in order to deliver. Obviously, our work on the offshore integrated coordination piece is going to create that backbone and that framework in which offshore wind developers can really move quickly to develop. And again, that will start to give certainty so supply chains can get ready to deliver that increase in capacity.
Chris Stark, have you got any view on this?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the terms of major infrastructure, you know, the story on net zero is littered with major infrastructure challenges. So it's not just in the energy networks or in the energy system either. So, but if you look at in terms of the things that we really need to see happen, I mean, we've talked a lot about renewables and offshore wind. I'm very confident that can happen. We've seen how well the current set of market models, market incentives are delivering now vast increases in capacity from offshore wind. We also need that transmission system that we've talked a lot about, but that needs to be well coordinated. At the moment, the way that offshore wind farms are connected to the shore is with point-to-point connections. So given the extent of the increase in capacity that's necessary over the next 25 to 30 years, that's another issue that needs to be tackled. There's some clues that that Whitehall are thinking about that in the energy white paper I just talked about. We also need the reinforcement of those distribution networks. It's not just a transmission question. We need that to happen early so that we can facilitate the increase in demand that we think there will be from especially electric vehicles and in time decarbonised heat which is done through electricity. So from our perspective, the major costs in that distribution story are actually in digging up the roads. So it's the civils. So actually planning ahead for a well-reinforced electricity network at local level is something that I would suggest is a major infrastructure challenge. And with it, the electric vehicle charging that relates strongly to how rapidly we can grow the installed base of electric cars is, I think, largely going to be dependent on how easy it is to charge them. So we need a better model for that in our towns and cities, one that works for people who don't have off-street parking as well. So again, that's another infrastructure challenge, easy to talk about, hard to get going. And then just the last things to say are that we've got a set of industrial challenges which will require infrastructure, carbon capture and storage. Scotland needs to be thinking now about where that infrastructure is going to be, how it's going to be paid for, and whether the model that's being worked on in Whitehall is going to work for the Scottish projects. And last two things, we'll need capacity for hydrogen to be generated and used, especially in industry as an alternative to fossil fuels. And I'm going to save the best till last, which is the biggest infrastructure challenge of all, is the overall question of how we decarbonise Scotland's heat system and move off the nearly all use of fossil fuels that we have at the moment to something fully decarbonised. So that's going to be a whole set of things that play out over the next few years. The Scottish Government's been hugely ambitious about how quickly those things can be pulled off in this document. But we'll need to be constructing the heat networks that we talked about earlier, the district heating networks. Hydrogen might have a role when it comes to domestic heat. Certainly does have a role, I think, for industry. So those networks need to be in place. And the other network that needs to work for heat is the electricity network itself. So that needs to be, just my final point, that needs to be reinforced too, ready for all the uses that we'll have for that electricity so that we can keep Scottish homes and Scottish buildings more generally warm in a decarbonised future. So that amounts to an enormous infrastructure programme, one that we think is perfectly achievable, but not something that can be sniffed at. We've got to plan that carefully. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the delayed national planning framework for a clue as to how that will all come together in the planning framework that the Scottish Government has.
Thank you. Moving on slightly, one of the positive aspects of all these initiatives that gets dangled in front of us is the number of jobs that potentially will be created. And various analyses have come forward that indicate that upwards of 60,000 new jobs can be created. We've heard all these estimates before, and they frankly haven't been achieved. Are these estimates credible? Are they actually achievable? Somebody like to comment on that, or Chris, you're still on screen, so
great.
Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think they're eminently achievable. So, I mean, it's a fool's errand to try and predict exactly how many jobs there are attached to any kind of transition like this, because it involves a huge amount of investment, a huge amount of industrial change, and with that, a huge amount of change in employment. I think the kind of growth in employment that's projected for all these low carbon proposals and alternatives that are contained in this document is entirely feasible. I mean, the biggest requirement is probably going to be in the challenge of decarbonising Scottish buildings, making them more energy efficient. That tends to be quite a labour-intensive thing. It's therefore quite a sensible thing to plan for as we emerge from a deep recession and the economic crisis that's come with this pandemic, because it's a good way of using up that spare capacity in the Scottish economy that we have at the moment. So that kind of place is a good place to look for jobs. And there's lots of optimism. You get this kind of Panglossian approach to this that says how great it's going to be. But the other thing that needs to be alongside that is the fact that some of the sectors will shrink, in particular the oil and gas sector, as we go in this decarbonisation journey. Now, all of the evidence from standard economics when it comes to employment and skills tells you that the best way to retrain someone and move them from an industry to another one is to do that while they're still employed and to begin those planning now. So I think the kind of job outlook that's contained in this document is one that I fully support and seems to me to be entirely credible. But it will need to have the package of skill support and retraining support that facilitates the movement of jobs across the economy from high carbon industries to low carbon industries. We've got a clue in the accompanying document on skills that went with the climate change plan update, but I'd like to see more on that. Actually, I'd like to understand better how that transition will take place, because this is an unusual thing in economics, that we can predict something that with some confidence that needs to take place over the coming decades. That means we should be able to plan well for it so that we don't end up in a kind of crisis situation for some of those jobs.
So just to interpret what you said there, some of those 60,000 jobs will in fact not be particularly new jobs. It'll be people coming out of the oil and gas industry and other high carbon industries and being retrained.
Yes, I think that's right. And again, it would be nice to see some guidance on how that will play out as far as Scottish ministers see it.
Julian, do you have a view on the job creation?
So, I mean, as the ESO, we don't employ directly in Scotland, but what I do know is that the assets and the scale of the investment plans that have just been approved by Ofgem for the Scottish TOs is requiring a huge uptick in capability and deliverability of some very, very large projects. Just the links from Scotland to England is £9 billion worth of investment between now and 2030. So there's huge amounts of investment which are going to require jobs and skilled labour in order to make that happen. But a more detailed response, then you'd need to speak to the Scottish TOs themselves in order to get that detail.
And Stephen, do you have a view on this?
It's similar to Julie. I mean, I don't have any basis to refute the numbers that have been posted. I think the scale of the investment programmes that we've got in Scotland, if you look at the transmission network, they are significant, and we were clear that will need a highly skilled and diverse workforce to deliver it. I think that the point on new skills is also important. I mean, we are moving to an increasingly data and digitalized based economy. I think there's new technologies that can be exploited, in the way that companies handle these technologies and manage their networks will vary over time. So that brings around new opportunities and new requirements. So I think overall, I would agree with Chris. I think it doesn't seem unreasonable, the scale of numbers that have been set out.
One final question based on some points that you've made. Where are the skills and training gaps in the electricity industry for achieving net zero, and how are these being addressed? Are they being addressed adequately?
From an Ofgem, I think from an Ofgem point of view, we make sure that the networks and for all the bits that we control, that relevant companies have in place the right processes that can lead to a trained and competent workforce, irrespective of the challenges that are faced. So I don't have any particular information on skills gaps. It's not something that I come across in my day-to-day working, but I think data and digital is probably a good way to look. I think that the vast opportunities that are created by new technologies, and I think new ways of managing the system, I think that's something that the companies are already responding to. But the scale of those challenges, and I think the opportunities will increase over time, and I think that's something they have to adjust to.
Right, I'm not wanting to cut anyone off, but also conscious of time and that we have two further members of the committee who'd like to pose some questions. So if you do have further comment on any of these issues or questions, please do feel free to write in. And indeed, there may be further points that arise in the course of the next two questioners that could benefit from comment after the committee meeting. So I'll come to Richard Lyle now.
Thank you, Convener. In the sake of time, I'll try to be brief. I have two questions, but basically to the panel, does the UK Government's Energy White Paper put the necessary support and framework in place to achieve the draft climate change plan ambitions? And does that paper and the draft CCP climate change plan adequately address the implementation gap as highlighted by the ECCLR committee? To anyone who wants to volunteer?
I can go. Mr. Lau. It's a difficult question to answer that one, because I think the ingredients are there in the Energy White Paper to support the many priorities spelled out in this climate change plan update from Scottish ministers. What's impossible to know is whether the market mechanisms will be there to lever in the sufficient private investment that's necessary to deliver those kind of outcomes. I think that's the secret sauce here, is that we haven't really understood how well supported these ambitions will be by the private sector, because most of the investments that will deliver net zero in Scotland, especially in the energy sector, will be private investments. They will rest in part, at least, on the kind of market mechanisms that are envisaged in the new Energy White Paper. So all I'll say is that it's a good start, that the Energy White Paper does have all of the right elements within it. So I mentioned some of them already: carbon capture and storage, hydrogen production, new arrangements for supporting renewables into the future. I think there's probably enough there that you could construct the kind of investment profile that would deliver the Scottish Government's ambitions. But what's not clear to me is that you've got the cooperation taking place between the Scottish Government and Westminster that would deliver that. So the real projects, as they're developed, need to be well supported to benefit from those market arrangements once they're in place, and that's going to require a lot of coordination north and south of the border. That's traditionally been much more of a problem, of course, when it comes to these projects.
Yeah, thanks for that. Stephen, can I ask you, should Ofgem have the explicit statutory objective to support the delivery of net zero? And what more should Ofgem be doing to support achieving net zero? And what incentives should there be put in place to encourage flexible use of electricity? To Stephen.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, on that point, I know it was raised earlier. I think we operate under a statutory remit that's set by the UK Government. I think that remit is to protect the interests of consumers both now and in the future. I'm sure you've heard that before. So that means keeping energy bills as low as possible while making sure there's enough investment to build a low carbon energy system for future generations. So we see our statutory duties as very much including like the requirement to hit the net zero targets passed by government. So I don't think we feel constrained in any way by our current remit to deliver net zero. But if there's any further guidance that comes forward around that from the UK Government, then that's something we welcome. I think in the Energy White Paper, they have committed to putting on an updated strategy and policy statement this year, so we welcome anything that comes from that. I think from our own point of view, like if you look at our forward work programme that was published just before Christmas, there is a recognition that like our regulation needs to constantly evolve and increase, like to make sure we can keep up with the pace of change that we're seeing out there, and make sure that for everything that we are responsible for, that we can like make the changes that are necessary to reflect that what's happening in the market and improve our regulation. So I think anything that happens there that improves that clarification, then great, but we don't feel constrained at the moment. I think on the point on incentives and flexibility, I think this is a really, really important point, because I think if you look at like the demand that we've got potentially coming forward from like electrification of transport and heat, we need to make sure that we make best use of the capacity we already have. I think partly through flexibility technologies. I think if you take a simple example, if we run the system as we are, and if everyone was to purchase an EV and goes home at night in a post-COVID world and charges it in during the peak evening period, then the amount of infrastructure we'll need will undoubtedly bring increased costs for consumers. But if we can flex when we take power off the system, when we charge our batteries at different times to make sure we're making the absolute maximum from those assets, then the cost will be more manageable. So I think that's the key point from us.
Okay, thanks for that. To everyone, I've always championed development, and basically my view is Scotland must be open for business, not closed. So what improvements should be made to and what efficiencies found in the consenting process to enable faster determinations of planning applications? What are the risks to communities to make them more efficient and speed them up? And what will the impact be of any delay to planning for the National Planning Framework projects? To anyone? Maybe Chris first.
I don't have too much to say about the experience of developers themselves. I should put on the record that in a former life, the job I did before this was in the Scottish Government, and I was the Director for Energy and Climate Change, and I had responsibility for the advice that ministers received on those energy consents for transmission and for new wind farms onshore. So I have some experience of it. Yeah, and it was, I mean, it's a job I loved. Yeah, I can answer on a personal basis that I think the system in Scotland works very well, in particular because the Scottish Energy Minister looks at the application in the end. I think that's a really strong part of the Scottish system. I would love to see more community involvement in that process, but I would love to see it in such a way that doesn't delay good projects. I think that it's really important that we have a system that allows communities to have their say. Of course, it also allows communities to have a stake in those projects, be that the jobs themselves or a share of the revenue from the project. But there has been, I think, a history in Scotland of projects taking too long to get through that consenting process. The lesson of this plan from Scottish ministers that we have before us now is that we need to do a lot of things very, very quickly. So we're going to need to, in particular, some big commercial projects need to be developed over the next, less than 10 years if we're going to make these kind of targets and meet the objectives that are in the plan. A good consenting system can support that. It needs to be really well oiled. So I'd like to see preparation now for rapid consenting of some of those projects, particularly the ones that we can eyeball and understand now where they're going to be. We could start that process early, perhaps. But that it's always been a vexed question. It's always been difficult, and of course we would never want to see communities robbed of the opportunity to come in and have their say. So it's not an easy thing. It's easy for me to say that the energy system might need X. It's much harder to construct the process to gather in the views of a local community about that development itself. The last thing I'll say in this is that I would also like to see much greater focus on the opportunity that comes from jobs from those projects. So I think that can be a really substantive part of the application process. That would be very helpful.
Yeah, if they get a planning application here, they've got to build here, or they've got to supply from Scotland. Totally agree with you. Just quickly, convener, to Julian, can the national grid cope with a sudden explosion of projects?
So in terms of, the explosion doesn't happen that quickly, so we've always got time to plan. We've got the relevant remits in place in terms of sort of connect and manage for new generation, so we have the right processes in place to allow the connection of the generation. In terms of demand, we've seen a massive demand decrease over the last 10 years following the financial crisis in 2008. So we know that from a transmission system that it is capable of supplying maybe up to 60 gigawatts across Britain. And this winter's peak so far, and I know COVID is a bit less as well, but it's only 44 gigawatts of peak demand that we've seen. So there's plenty of capacity to supply demand in the short to medium term, and there's plenty of capacity to facilitate the connection of the rapid increase in offshore and onshore renewable projects over the next 10 years.
Okay, thank you, convener.
All right, thank you. Now the deputy convener, Rolly Coffey.
Thanks very much, Gordon. Just finally from me, just a couple of questions, I think, on the negative emissions technologies that I mentioned in the first panel. Probably the first question to Chris, I think. Is it realistic to expect us that we'll meet the targets that we've given ourselves to provide net reductions in things like carbon capture and storage technologies by 2029? I mentioned that earlier. Is that realistically possible? So where are we on that journey, do you think? And I'll just roll it into the same question, if you don't mind, just to Julian and Stephen. What's the role for Ofgem and the National Grid in taking all of this forward, and how do you see you assisting both governments to try and achieve our aims?
I'll kick off if that's all right. So, I mean, I think one of the most notable features of this new climate change plan update is the extent of use of negative emission technologies. You know, there's really quite a lot of it by 2032, and as you say, by 2029 we've got that being used commercially at scale. So maybe a few words on that. So when we look across the whole of the UK, we see an important role for these negative emission technologies. And when in our last assessment, we looked at how you might allocate that across the UK, and we thought between 3 to 9 megatons per year of greenhouse gas removals could be taking place through that means. The kind of headline here is that the Scottish Government have achieved that by 2030. So, you know, that's pretty tasty, to put it mildly, and that is ambitious. So developing that is going to be a big challenge. I think the other thing to say is that those negative emission technologies are being used almost entirely in the electricity sector. So we're using probably biomass, so we're growing trees potentially here in Scotland, then using that in the electricity process and the generation of electricity, capturing the carbon and storing it in the North Sea. That is a process that I think is entirely feasible, but I think developing it at the scale that would need to be developed is going to be such a huge challenge. So when you think about that electricity challenge, we know that Yorkshire has Drax Power Station, and they're set up pretty well to do that. Call it bioenergy with CCS. They're pretty well set up to do that bioenergy with CCS. I'm not aware of a power plant yet in development or in operation in Scotland that could deliver those negative emissions in the Scottish power sector. So to put all of that in perspective, we're going to need to see a new commercial bioenergy with CCS generation plant developed at a Scottish site. It could be developed at the existing Peterhead site that's currently gas generation. It would have to go through a pilot stage, have to then reach financial close, and finally be constructed by 2029 to start generating in line with the negative emission technology numbers that we've got in this plan. All of that then needs to be achieved, of course, over quite a difficult period when, as we've discussed, the first few years are going to be taken up with developing the commercial models for carbon capture and storage and various other things. The Scottish Government have also promised to consult on various elements of that too, bioenergy and hydrogen, amongst other things. So I think this is going to be, I mean, it's feasible, but it's going to be hugely challenging. My own take on it, for what it's worth, is that I think what we're seeing here is the dangers of setting a target that's too stringent in the short term. So it looks like to me that what we're seeing is an artifact from the 2030 emissions target. So it looks like negative emission technologies, and I would also say that the commitments the Scottish Government have made on decarbonised heat are really in this plan to try and make the numbers up. The admission of the analysis in this document, the document itself has a really interesting message from the analysts that the modelling couldn't get us to that 2030 target. So instead, we've had to allocate the extra emissions across the economy in some form. So that's a really interesting thing. It looks to me like negative emissions has been the release valve here. So, you know, I'd love to see this happen. But to come to fruition, we're going to need to, again, the Scottish Government and the officials north and south of the border to work hand in glove with Whitehall if we're going to get those market models in place, if we're going to get those real projects developed. And the lion's share of bioenergy with CCS projects would need to be in Scotland in a very competitive field across the UK.
Thank you for that. Julian, Stephen, what's your perspective on this, and how do we accelerate this to try and achieve the targets within the timescales that we're all talking about? What's the role for both governments and to work collaboratively with one another to try and achieve this?
So if I go first then. So from an ESO perspective, the future energy scenarios have negative emission technologies at the heart of it. It's absolutely crucial in terms of decarbonising the harder to reach sectors and therefore offsetting the carbon that will still be transmitted in other sectors. So our role in all of this is saying that we support it, seeing how it fits into a pathway, a credible pathway to 2030 and beyond, and then facilitating the connections and finding if it's providing services to the grid, then are there any sort of ancillary service sort of products and markets that can participate in to help with the financing? But fundamentally, though, the projects, from our perspective, will be finding their own funding and need to stand on their own 2 feet. And we will then just facilitate their connection to the grid and get the benefits of doing so.
Okay. Even Ofgem's role in assisting us to move this forward?
I mean, I would agree with what Chris and Julian said. I think the targets in this area are incredibly ambitious, but I don't think the plan suggests in any way that technologies alone will get Scotland there. I think there is like a deep recognition of some of the harder changes around behavioural change and reducing energy consumption where we can. I think from an Ofgem point of view, I would say there's probably space for all these technologies. If some of them aren't viable, then there may well be alternatives. In terms of our role, I think it's something that we are engaged in. I think it's mainly around working with government to make sure any business and regulatory investment models to support these zero and negative carbon technologies are in place so that we can make sure that our regulation can support their delivery, like should they materialise.
Okay, that's very helpful. I think I'll leave it at that, Convener, given we're pressed for time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much to all of our witnesses for coming in today, or rather appearing virtually for the committee. And if there is further information, please don't hesitate to write in to us. So thank you once again. We'll now move on to item agenda 3, which is the Financial Assistance for Environmental Purposes Scotland Order 2020, which is SSI 2020/409. Does any member have any substantive issues they wish to raise, or are they content that the instrument comes into force? It appears we're all agreed it should come into force, so that's agreed. We will move to private session with a view to recommencing in private session at 11:45. All right, thank you.